mix it up this morning. A little Spanish music.
I love
to get
it.
y'all going.
Honestly.
To get folks going.
I know. This is. We promise we'll try to be fun. So thank you so much for being here. I think J Street is a pretty cool story about what kind of organization progressives can build in a short period of time. So it's awesome that you showed up. First question for you. Pardon me. First question for you. Mayor Pete just talked a bit about his belief that we need to condition aid to Israel in the event of some sort of annexation of the West Bank as promised by Bibi Netanyahu. Is that something that you would also support?
That would be my first move. First of all, I think that, look, what I hope is that as Israel forms a new government, that we're going to have a new opportunity to work with our ally to ensure that there is not unilateral annexation, that we pursue a two-state solution, which, as you all know, has been the approach that the United States has taken for a very long time and used to have strong support, I think, on both sides of the aisle. And so my hope is that we can work like crazy so that we don't get to that point. I would not take it off the table, but I want to focus on what we can do, hopefully with a new government and a new president in January of 2021 that is willing to work with our allies to avoid that.
So I just want to push you on this a little bit because I think, Ben and I have been fairly clear about our beliefs on Prime Minister Netanyahu versus Benny Gantz. But I think, there's a sense that on the peace process question, they won't be as different as people might hope. And, historically, you've seen aid be conditioned in many places, including on the Palestinian Authority, to pressure them into incentivizing behavior. The American taxpayer is doing, I think, $3.8 billion a year in security assistance to Israel because of our boss, President Obama, signed this 10-year MOU. Why isn't it appropriate to sort of normalize the way that aid is treated and to use it as, a carrot and stick approach towards pushing for policies that we think are in the security of Israel and in the U.S.?
Well, the fact is that in so many different ways, we do have a carrot and stick approach, whether we're dealing with money that's domestically granted or with foreign assistance, including security assistance. And so I think that framework already exists. The intensity of it or the specificity of it may be something different. That's why I say I would not take that off the table. I do think, though, that we need to use this opportunity that we have, hopefully with the new Israeli government and with a new administration, I believe, in 2021, to do everything that we can to get Israel to go back in the direction of pursuing a two-state solution so that we can avoid having to condition our aid on that. I completely agree with you that I believe that Netanyahu has been counterproductive, to say the least, and has partisanized Israel for a lot of people here in the country, which was a terrible mistake that was made a few years ago, and that we need an administration over there, a government over there that I hope will be more productive and engage in getting back on a track of a two-state solution, because it's very clear that Netanyahu not only has rejected that, but has actively campaigned for his own political benefit far away from that. And I disagree with his approach, and I reject it. And I hope, even though, as you point out and others have pointed out, that Benny Gantz may not be very different, I still hope that there's a way that we can avoid the path that Israel has been on under Netanyahu.
Another question is, there's how do we engage the government of Israel when the new president comes in? Another way of looking at this also is how do we engage the Palestinians who, have seen the United States Embassy move to Jerusalem, have seen their own diplomatic relationship with the U.S. essentially downgraded because the consulate that used to be the representation towards them is now obviously been subsumed by the embassy, seen efforts by the Trump administration to cut off assistance to them, and frankly, even to Palestinian citizens of Israel. There's been a prime minister of Israel who's been fully embraced by the U.S. president, who's used very derogatory language about Palestinian citizens of Israel. What would you do coming into office to try to set a new tone with the Palestinian people as well as the Israeli people?
Number one, the Trump administration has made a mistake in putting its finger on the scale so much in line with Netanyahu and his administration. And I am glad to see in this Democratic primary that the voices of folks who are concerned about the rights of Palestinians has risen stronger than before. I think that's a good thing. And I hope that that also figures into our approach in the future. Under me, it would. So here are a couple things I would do, and you mentioned one of them, which is that we need to reestablish a U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem and make clear that under a two-state approach, that would be the embassy under a Palestinian state. In addition to that, we need to ensure that they have the opportunity to restart their mission here in the United States. Right? I would also restore the UN funding, UN RWA funding that was stripped by the Trump administration, which was a mistake, to provide aid that is desperately needed. Those are the kinds of things that I believe the next president could do immediately to regain some trust, rebuild trust and confidence among Palestinians, in addition to taking a different tone.
Yeah. Well, I think those would all be important steps. And then obviously the question of how do you approach the Israeli-Palestinian peace issue comes to the forefront. I assume you wouldn't send Jared Kushner to a meeting in the Gulf without any Israelis or Palestinian representatives. But obviously one of the things that we wrestled with in the Obama administration, which you obviously were part of, but which is how specific to be about U.S. positions in terms of what should be the outcome of negotiations. It's long-standing position of the U.S. government, had usually been these final status issues of refugees, security, territory in Jerusalem are kind of left to the parties to negotiate. But by the end of our administration, we, out of a mixture of frustration and diplomatic work, were very specific about at least what U.S. ideas would be for those. Would you think that it'd be constructive, given how much settlement activity has begun to reach into territory that most independent observers think would be a part of a Palestinian state in the West Bank in particular? Do you think that the U.S. should be specific in laying out, here's what we think the outcome of this should be, here's what the two states, in our view, should look like as at least terms for a negotiation?
Yeah, well, I remember, and I'm sure you remember even better than I do, when President Obama, what was it, about 10 years ago, right, early in his administration, said what others had been saying, which is that we wanted to base this off the 1967 borders with land swaps. And then you remember the furor that the right wing went into after he made that.
Netanyahu conveniently left out the land swaps in his
That's right. But,
presentation.
I think that has been the blueprint. And I do agree that that we can add something of value to the negotiation. Of course, the negotiation is between those two parties ultimately, and so there's a limit to that, but I do think giving some direction, and I understand, of course, the frustration and the sense of urgency of the need for specificity. I think we can build on that, again, hopefully with an administration that is more receptive to that.
Official Washington, Ben often calls them the blob, I think he deserves to trademark that name, has slowly come to the realization that the Saudi government and Mohammed bin Salman in particular aren't the best people. I think the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi shocked the conscience of the world. It's truly disappointing to see major businesses, political leaders, a year later attending, investment conferences in Saudi Arabia. I think it sends a message that, finances are more important than values. But, and again, I say this with considerable humility, given that President Obama went to Saudi Arabia multiple times. He initially supported the civil war in Yemen, which was wrong and has proven to be a humanitarian disaster. So my question for you is, as president, how would you rethink, or would you, the U.S.-Saudi relationship? Are they still an ally, given all that we've learned in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I agree with those who say that I think we need to reassess that relationship. I believe that we do need to reassess that relationship, and that as we move forward in this 21st century, that, as you suggest, that our values should be bigger drivers of those relationships. Obviously, sometimes there are very urgent, imperative security interests, sometimes economic interests, but I believe that somewhere along the way, we've come to rely too much on those interests or prioritize them instead of prioritizing the values that we have. And what are those values? I mean, I think those values are the ones that have helped make this nation the nation that it is, of freedom, of individual liberty, of democracy, and whether it's what we've seen in Hong Kong, and that we should be standing up for them in Hong Kong, or the Uyghurs in China that we should be speaking up for. We should be leading with our values more, and the next president has the opportunity to do that. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, I would do that.
Thank you for mentioning the Uyghurs. It's really important, I think, that people constantly bring that up. So, sort of staying in Saudi Arabia, I mean, a month ago, 2 months ago, I think a lot of us were worried that we were on the cusp of either a Saudi-Iran war or U.S. military action in response to what was seen as either a Iranian proxy group or the Iranian military striking Saudi facilities. How would you approach any effort to broker, some sort of détente between the Saudis and the Iranians? Would that involve getting back into the Iran nuclear deal? I mean, what are the pieces of that puzzle in your mind?
Well, I think that the immediate piece that the next president can work on, I wish this administration would work on it, is getting back into the deal that y'all negotiated in the Obama administration, getting back into the JCPOA. The first task may be pressuring Iran to make sure that they're compliant with the JCPOA, but also getting the United States into it. And then looking down the road at how that can be negotiated again, updated, renegotiated, whatever term we want to use for that. And one of the points that I've been making out there on the campaign trail is that this is much more important than, although in and of itself this is an important deal to control or to manage their nuclear weapons capacity. This speaks to, again, the element of trust of the United States in the world. Like, why in the world, if you're Kim Jong-un, would you ever sign an agreement with the United States right now to curtail your nuclear weapons program when Trump just came in and tore up an agreement that everybody acknowledged Iran was following, right, to do the very thing that we're asking North Korea essentially to do, curtail their program? We've lost trust. People have lost respect for the United States under this administration, and I see getting back into the JCPOA not only as helpful with managing what we're talking about, the dynamics of the region, and of course that nuclear weapons program and the security of Israel, but also where we go on North Korea and a number of other issues around the world.
I think you say that very well, and just to pivot off foreign policy to the politics that we can envision on some of these set of issues, particularly on Israel. One of the things that has been so depressing about how this administration, this president has approached this, is this kind of cynical effort to demonize as anti-Semitic, anybody who's not fully on board with essentially his and Prime Minister Netanyahu's view of all these issues. And while at the same time, frankly, using rhetoric that seems to be very attractive to actual anti-Semites here in the United States on other things. But if you were the nominee, how would you contend with the inevitable attacks that would come, that any criticism of Israel proves that you're an anti-Semite, the kind of politics that says I'm a U.S. president. I'm going to ask the Prime Minister of Israel to not even let in two Muslim American members of Congress to visit Israel. This kind of toxicity that we see, as you know, that is very bad for, I think, the historical bipartisan support for this relationship. How would you navigate that terrain as a nominee and make clear that there's a way to support Israel while being critical of some of its policies? There's a way to advocate for our values that doesn't necessarily mean you have to fall into the trap of what they're going to be throwing at you.
Well, I mean, that's why I'm here. That's why J Street is here, right? And that's why there's so many folks in this audience that are part of this work, which is to say, look, there's a different way that we can do things, and we recognize that Israel is an ally, a friend, and that will continue to be, and we'll have a strong working relationship, a friendship. At the same time, the road that Netanyahu is taking Israel on, I don't believe is in the best interest of Israelis, and the road that Donald Trump is taking this relationship on is not in the best interest of the United States of America. It's not in the best interest of Palestinians, whose rights we're also concerned about. But I think, you know, I want to commend Jeremy and J Street and the board members, everybody who over the last 11 years has been building up this organization, because it is a strong part of that voice. Now we're just talking about the politics of this, because you asked about the politics that will help navigate that, because we do need those voices there. For the longest time, you know, there was kind of one voice, and you know, I think folks know what I'm talking about, and we need more than that.
You know, I'll to follow up on that. Yeah, I think I know the voice you're alluding to that offered some criticism of the Obama administration over the years. But so, I think actually that's kind of a part of a general sense. You know, if you're out on the campaign trail and you're meeting with young people in particular, you're meeting with college-age students, many of whom are here today, and all they really consumed about this relationship between the U.S. and Israel is a lot of this pretty cynical back and forth and demonization. And if you don't support this 100%, then you know you're going to be called a name, whether that's anti-Semitic or something else. What would you tell them to get back to values and not politics? Why should they care about the U.S.-Israel relationship, or why should they care about the pursuit of a two-state solution? Like, what if in many ways Trump is disrupting things and wiping so many slates so clean, and we're going to have to rebuild things, what is the basis upon which you rebuild that sense of why young people need to care about this, why they need to care about Israel, why they need to care about the Palestinians, why they need to care about peace?
You know, I think yesterday was the anniversary of the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh. And it was also a very powerful reminder of why Israel exists in the first place, as a place of refuge, of safety, of ability of expression of the Jewish people, and also of how consistent those values are with the values that we hold dear as Americans. And that we also want to see Palestinians be able to enjoy as human beings. Right? And so I would say that in many ways that if we can get this right, that it is of our highest calling to help bring that about, because it's consistent with who we are and who we want to be. And today, you know, you mentioned young people, folks on college campuses. I think they're hearing it both ways from the Trump administration. What they're hearing is, you know, if you're not all the way over here, then, you know, you're anti-Semitic and so forth. They're also hearing from BDS, right? And there's a demonization of Israel in some quarters. And, you know, I don't agree with BDS. I don't support BDS, but I also don't support cracking down on political speech. I think that people should be able to express themselves. And what I have seen in our young people now that, like, all of the candidates have traveled all over the place, and so have you all the time, is that more than anything else, people want to know what you really believe. And I think to connect with young people, it's to connect them with what we really believe and why we support a two-state solution and the values that represents. And, you know, we can do that. And I think part of that is the work that J Street and other organizations and some pro-Palestinian organizations are also doing as they get out there.
You know, it's cliched to say that Israel is in a tough neighborhood, right? But I do think that fact is underscored by the fact that the head of ISIS, Mr. Baghdadi, was killed in Idlib province yesterday, 2 days ago. And, you know, the special forces who were part of that operation, the intelligence community, the Trump administration, all deserve credit for taking him off the battlefield. But that doesn't mean our Syria policy isn't completely incoherent, right? We pulled out, we're back in, we're ditching the Kurds, we're now securing oil fields. It's hard to keep track of. When you think about Israel's security, I imagine that, you know, a secure Syria is a key piece of that puzzle. What do you make of Trump's Syria policy today? And, you know, knowing that projecting what troop levels would be, you know, a year from now is not really a realistic thought experiment, how would you think about the presence of U.S. troops in Syria, in the region, to try to, you know, deal with ISIS and keep it stable?
Yeah, you know, it's already been said a million times. It doesn't need to be said anymore that the president has been so erratic that it has been a disaster, abandoning our allies, causing others to doubt our loyalty, setting us back in Syria itself, empowering the Russians. You know, that part has been a disaster. In terms of how I view the presence of U.S. troops, you know, I agree with those who say that we should be drawing down from the Middle East in different places. But I also believe two things. Number one, that has to be, you have to be as thoughtful coming out as you are going in. And what we saw in Iraq was a lack of thoughtfulness, seriousness going in. What we see in Syria was a lack of thoughtfulness coming out. I believe that whether it's there or Afghanistan or other places, there is a role for a small level of forces in a supportive capacity, whether they're special operations forces, diplomatic forces, also to be able to support our efforts and to help to maintain stability. Yeah, and I believe that may well be where we still end up getting to in Syria. It's hard to tell because, you know, the president on one day will say one thing, on another day will say another, then he'll tweet something out that's completely different from what he said twice. But I hope that we can get to a point where we don't have, in several places, don't have thousands of troops there, but we are able to contribute to maintaining a stability.
It's you know, one last you know, question to close here. You know, you talked before about credibility generally, and you know, we've talked about a lot of issues in a tough neighborhood. But stepping back, you know, what would you do coming into office to try to restore and reset American credibility in the world that has suffered so much because of, you know, pulling out of international agreements, because of what images people are seeing here from home, because of the Twitter feed? How would you go about the project from day one of saying, here's how I'm presenting a new face of America to the world?
That is maybe the biggest challenge for us, because I think that what these leaders around the world are feeling in their head, more thinking in their head, is that they see the limits of our government, and by that I mean the limit to how constant or stable our approach can be, because you can have a new president every 4 years, and because you have so much polarization in Congress, right? So there are some things that I do think that the next president can do. Number one, to make very clear during this campaign where you stand on these issues as clearly as possible, to lay that out once you are elected as early as possible, to indicate through your appointments to ambassadorships and appointments within the administration, people who have a track record of expertise and of being clear, what this president has done to the State Department and decimating it the way that he has and so forth. But in your words and your actions coming into office, you can send very strong signals about the direction that you're going to take. I also think there are longer-term things that we need to do for our benefit that will also do for the benefit of relationships around the world. For instance, supporting that H.R. 1 that would take all states to nonpartisan or neutral redistricting, right? Because if you want to reduce the polarization in Congress and people to work together, you're going to need to give these congressional people an incentive to reach across the aisle. So I tie in my mind, I'm connecting all of these dots of how we need to change our system here, make improvements, not only to what they're going to do to improve our governance at home, but how they're going to impact the trust and our ability to operate overseas. And, that's going to take a while to make these reforms, but in the long run, I believe that that's going to pay off. And more than anything else, you just need to get off Twitter and stop being so erratic, people are not going to trust right away that the next president is going to be more stable, but they'll see that. You need to live up to that. And we had a great example of that in President Obama. Even though we disagreed with George W. Bush and some of the Republican presidents, they were a lot more consistent than this guy has been. We need to get back to a consistency.
So you would make Rudy Giuliani your Secretary of State, is what you're saying. Just butt dialing all around the nation. Secretary Castro, thank you so much for all the work you did.
Gracias. Thank y'all.
Give it up.
Thank you very much.